This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real events or persons is purely coincidental. This story is purely fictional and does not promote or encourage any form of violence. My eyes. Often have I wondered which of my ill-considered juvenile remarks it was that caused this sudden resolution on his part to commit suicide. Whichever it might be, since then I have made it a rigid law never to speak for my own pleasure, but only to help others. I came eventually to the Marest. I threaded its mazes in terror for 4 days. I was frightened of death, but still more terrified at the possibility of losing my sacred attitude toward life. When I was nearly through, and was beginning to congratulate myself, I stumbled across the third extraordinary personage of my experience, the grim Muri Maker. It was under horrible circumstances. On an afternoon, cloudy and stormy, I saw, suspended in the air without visible support, a living man. He was hanging in an upright position in front of a cliff. A yawning gulf, 1,000 feet deep, lay beneath his feet. I climbed as near as I could and looked on. He saw me and made a wry grimace, like one who wishes to turn his humiliation into humor. The spectacle so astounded me that I could not even grasp what had happened. "I am Muri Maker," he cried in a scraping voice which shocked my ears. "All my life I have sorbed others. Now I am sorbed. Nuclamp and I fell out over a woman. Now Nuclamp holds me up like this. While the strength of his will lasts, I shall remain suspended. But when he gets tired, and it can't be long now, I drop into those depths." Had it been another man, I would have tried to save him, but this ogre-like being was too well known to me, as one who passed his whole existence in tormenting, murdering, and absorbing others for the sake of his own delight. I hurried away, and did not pause again that day. In Poolingdred, I met Joywind. We walked and talked together for a month, and by that time we found that we loved each other too well to part. Punaway stopped speaking. "That is a fascinating story," remarked Maskell. "Now I begin to know my way around better. But one thing puzzles me." "What's that?" "How it happens that men here are ignorant of tools and arts, and have no civilization, and yet contrive to be social in their habits, and wise in their thoughts. Do you imagine, then, that love and wisdom spring from tools? But I see how it arises. In your world you have fewer sense organs, and to make up for the deficiency you have been obliged to call in the assistance of stones and metals. That's by no means a sign of superiority." "No, I suppose not," said Maskell, "but I see I have a great deal to unlearn." They talked together a little longer, and then gradually fell asleep. Joywind opened her eyes, smiled, and slumbered again. Chapter 8. The Lusian Plain. Maskell awoke before the others. He got up, stretched himself, and walked out into the sunlight. Branchspell was already declining. He climbed to the top of the crater edge and looked away toward Ifdawn. The afterglow of Alpane had by now completely disappeared. The mountains stood up wild and grand. They impressed him like a simple musical theme, the notes of which are widely separated in the scale. A spirit of rashness, daring, and adventure seemed to call to him from them. It was at that moment that the determination flashed into his heart to walk to the Marest and explore its dangers. He returned to the cavern to say goodbye to his hosts. Joywind looked at him with her brave and honest eyes. "Is this selfishness, Maskell?" she asked. "Or are you drawn by something stronger than yourself?" "We must be reasonable," he answered, smiling. "I can't settle down in Poolingdred before I have found out something about this surprising new planet of yours. Remember what a long way I have come." very likely I shall come back here. Will you make me a promise?" Maskell hesitated. "Ask nothing difficult, for I hardly know my powers yet. It is not hard, and I wish it. Promise this, never to raise your hand against a living creature, either to strike, pluck, or eat, without first recollecting its mother, who suffered for it." "Perhaps I won't promise that," said Maskell slowly, "but I'll undertake something more tangible. I will never lift my hand against a living creature without first recollecting you, Joywind." She turned a little pale. Now if Panaway knew that Panaway existed, he might be jealous. Panaway put his hand on her gently. "You would not talk like that in Shaping's presence," he said. "No. Forgive me. I'm not quite myself. Perhaps it is Maskell's blood in my veins. Now let us bid him adieu. Let us pray that he will do only honorable deeds, wherever he may be." "I'll set Maskell on his way," said Panaway. "There's no need," replied Maskell. "The way is plain, but talking shortens the road." Maskell turned to go. Joywind pulled him around toward her softly. "You won't think badly of other women on my account?" "You are a blessed spirit," answered he. She trod quietly to the inner extremity of the cave and stood there thinking. Panaway and Maskell emerged into the open air. Halfway down the cliff face, a little spring was encountered. Its water was colorless, transparent, but gaseous. As soon as Maskell had satisfied his thirst, he felt himself different. His surroundings were so real to him in their vividness and color, so unreal in their phantom-like mystery, that he scrambled downhill like one in a winter's dream. When they reached the plain, he saw in front of them an interminable forest of tall trees, the shapes of which were extraordinarily foreign-looking. The leaves were crystalline, and, looking upward, it was as if he were gazing through a roof of glass. The moment they got underneath the trees, the light rays of the sun continued to come through, white, savage, and blazing, but they were gelded of heat. Then it was not hard to imagine that they were wandering through cool, bright elfin glades. Through the forest, beginning at their very feet, an avenue, perfectly straight and not very wide, went forward as far as the eye could see. Maskell wanted to talk to his traveling companion, but was somehow unable to find words. Panaway glanced at him with an inscrutable smile, stern, yet enchanting and half feminine. He then broke the silence, but, strangely enough, Maskell could not make out whether he was singing or speaking. From his lips issued a slow musical recitative, exactly like a bewitching adagio from a low-toned stringed instrument. But there was a difference. Instead of the repetition and variation of one or two short themes, as in music, Panaway's theme was prolonged. It never came to an end, but rather resembled a conversation in rhythm and melody, and at the same time it was no recitative, for it was not declamatory. It was a long, quiet stream of lovely emotion. Maskell listened entranced, yet agitated. The song, if it might be termed song, seemed to be always just on the point of becoming clear and intelligible, not with the intelligibility of words, but in the way one sympathizes with another's moods and feelings. And Maskell felt that something important was about to be uttered, which would explain all that had gone before. But it was invariably postponed. He never understood. And yet somehow, he did understand. Late in the afternoon they came to a clearing, and there Panaway ceased his recitative. He slowed his pace and stopped, in the fashion of a man who wishes to convey that he intends to go no farther. "What is the name of this country?" asked Maskell. "It is the Lusian Plain." Was that music in the nature of a temptation? "Do you wish me not to go on? Your work lies before you, and not behind you." "What was it then? What work do you allude to?" "It must have seemed like something to you, Maskell." It seemed like shaping music to me. The instant he had absently uttered these words, Maskell wondered why he had done so, as they now appeared meaningless to him. Panaway, however, showed no surprise. Shaping you will find everywhere. Am I dreaming or awake? You are awake. Maskell fell into deep thought. So be it, he said, rousing himself. Now I will go on. But where must I sleep tonight? You will reach a broad river. On that you can travel to the foot of the Marist tomorrow. But tonight you had better sleep where the forest and river meet. Adieu then, Panaway. But do you wish to say anything more to me? Only this, Maskell. Wherever you go, help to make the world beautiful and not ugly. That's more than any of us can undertake. I am a simple man and have no ambitions in the way of beautifying life. But tell Joywind, I will try to keep myself pure. They parted rather coldly. Maskell stood erect where they had stopped and watched Panaway out of sight. He sighed more than once. He became aware that something was about to happen. The air was breathless. The late afternoon sunshine, unobstructed, wrapped his frame in voluptuous heat. A solitary cloud, immensely high, raced through the sky overhead. A single trumpet note sounded in the far distance from somewhere behind him. It gave him an impression of being several miles away at first, but then it slowly swelled and came nearer and nearer at the same time that it increased in volume. Still the same note sounded, but now it was as if blown by a giant trumpeter immediately over his head. Then it gradually diminished in force and traveled away in front of him. It ended very faintly and distantly. He felt himself alone with nature. A sacred stillness came over his heart. Past and future were forgotten. The forest, the sun, the day did not exist for him. He was unconscious of himself. He had no thoughts and no feelings. Yet never had life had such an altitude for him. A man stood with crossed arms, right in his path. He was so clothed that his limbs were exposed, while his body was covered. He was young, rather than old. Maskell observed that his countenance possessed none of the special organs of torments, to which he had not even yet become reconciled. He was smooth-faced. His whole person seemed to radiate an excess of life, like the trembling of air on a hot day. His eyes had such force that Maskell could not meet them. He addressed Maskell by name in an extraordinary voice. It had a double tone. The primary one sounded far away. The second was an undertone, like a sympathetic tanging string. Maskell felt a rising joy as he continued standing in the presence of this individual. He believed that something good was happening to him. He found it physically difficult to bring any words out. Why do you stop me? Maskell, look well at me. Who am I? I think you are shaping. I am Surtur. Maskell again attempted to meet his eyes, but felt as if he were being stabbed. You know that this is my world. Why do you think I have brought you here? I wish you to serve me. Maskell could no longer speak. Those who joke at my world, continued the vision. Those who make a mock of its stern, eternal rhythm, its beauty and sublimity, which are not skin-deep, but proceed from fathomless roots, they shall not escape. I do not mock it. Ask me your questions, and I will answer them. I have nothing. It is necessary for you to serve me, Maskell. Do you not understand? You are my servant and helper. I shall not fail. This is for my sake, and not for yours. These last words had no sooner left Surtur's mouth than Maskell saw him spring suddenly upward and outward. Looking up at the vault of the sky, he saw the whole expanse of vision filled by Surtur's form, not as a concrete man, but as a vast, concave cloud image, looking down and frowning at him. Then the spectacle vanished, as a light goes out. Maskell stood inactive, with a thumping heart. Now he again heard the solitary trumpet note. The sound began this time faintly in the far distance in front of him, traveled slowly toward him with regularly increasing intensity, passed overhead at its loudest and then grew more and more quiet, wonderful and solemn, as it fell away in the rear, until the note was merged in the death-like silence of the forest. It appeared to Maskell like the closing of a marvelous and important chapter. Simultaneously with the fading away of the sound, the heavens seemed to open up with the rapidity of lightning into a blue vault of immeasurable height. He breathed a great breath, stretched all his limbs, and looked around him with a slow smile. After a while he resumed his journey. His brain was all dark and confused, but one idea was already beginning to stand out from the rest. Huge, shapeless, and grand, like the growing image in the soul of a creative artist, the staggering thought that he was a man of destiny. The more he reflected upon all that had occurred since his arrival in this new world, and even before leaving Earth, the clearer and more indisputable it became that he could not be here for his own purposes, but must be here for an end. But what that end was, he could not imagine. Through the forest he saw Branchspel at last, sinking in the west. It looked a stupendous ball of red fire. Now he could realize at his ease what a sun it was. The avenue took an abrupt turn to the left and began to descend steeply. A wide, rolling river of clear and dark water was visible in front of him, no great way off. It flowed from north to south. The forest path led him straight to its banks. Maskell stood there and regarded the lapping, gurgling waters pensively. On the opposite bank, the forest continued. Miles to the south, Poolingdred could just be distinguished. On the northern skyline, the Ifdawn Mountains loomed up, high, wild, beautiful, and dangerous. They were not a dozen miles away. Like the first mutterings of a thunderstorm, the first faint breaths of cool wind, Maskell felt the stirrings of passion in his heart. In spite of his bodily fatigue, he wished to test his strength against something. This craving he identified with the crags of the Marist. They seemed to have the same magical attraction for his will as the lodestone for iron. He kept biting his nails as he turned his eyes in that direction, wondering if it would not be possible to conquer the heights that evening. But when he glanced back again at Poolingdred, he remembered Joywind and Panaway, and grew more tranquil. He decided to make his bed at this spot, and to set off as soon after daybreak as he should awake. He drank at the river, washed himself, and lay down on the bank to sleep. By this time, so far had his idea progressed that he cared nothing for the possible dangers of the night. He confided in his star. Branchspel set. The day faded. Night with its terrible weight came on, and through it all, Maskell slept. Long before midnight, however, he was awakened by a crimson glow in the sky. He opened his eyes and wondered where he was. He felt heaviness and pain. The red glow was a terrestrial phenomenon. It came from among the trees. He got up and went toward the source of the light. Away from the river, not 100 feet off, he nearly stumbled across the form of a sleeping woman. The object which emitted the crimson rays was lying on the ground, several yards away from her. It was like a small jewel throwing off sparks of red light. He barely threw a glance at that, however. The woman was clothed in the large skin of an animal. She had big, smooth, shapely limbs, rather muscular than fat. Her magni was not a thin tentacle, but a third arm, terminating in a hand. Her face, which was upturned, was wild, powerful, and exceedingly handsome. but he saw with surprise that in place of a breve on her forehead, she possessed another eye. All three were closed. The color of her skin in the crimson glow he could not distinguish. He touched her gently with his hand. She awoke calmly and looked up at him without stirring a muscle. All three eyes stared at him, but the two lower ones were dull and vacant, mere carriers of vision. The middle, upper one alone expressed her inner nature. Its haughty, unflinching glare had yet something seductive and alluring in it. Maskell felt a challenge in that look of lordly, feminine will, and his manner instinctively stiffened. She sat up. "Can you speak my language?" he asked. "I wouldn't put such a question, but others have been able to." "Why should you imagine that I can't read your mind? Is it so extremely complex?" She spoke in a rich, lingering musical voice, which delighted him to listen to. "No, but you have no breve. Well, but haven't I a sorb, which is better?" And she pointed to the eye on her brow. "What is your name?" "Osiax." "And where do you come from?" "Ifdon." These contemptuous replies began to irritate him, and yet the mere sound of her voice was fascinating. "I'm going there tomorrow," he remarked. She laughed, as if against her will, but made no comment. "My name is Maskell," he went on. "I am a stranger, from another world, so I should judge from your absurd appearance. Perhaps it would be as well to say at once," said Maskell bluntly. "Are we, or are we not, to be friends?" She yawned and stretched her arms, without rising. "Why should we be friends? If I thought you were a man, I might accept you as a lover. You must look elsewhere for that. So be it, Maskell. Now go away, and leave me in peace." She dropped her head again to the ground, but did not at once close her eyes. "What are you doing here?" he interrogated. "Oh, we Ifdon folk occasionally come here to sleep, for there often enough it is a night for us which has no next morning." "Being such a terrible place and seeing that I am a total stranger, it would be merely courteous if you were to warn me what I have to expect in the way of dangers. I am perfectly and utterly indifferent to what becomes of you," retorted Osiax. "Are you returning in the morning?" persisted Maskell. "If I wish. Then we will go together." She got up again on her elbow. "Instead of making plans for other people, I would do a very necessary thing." "Pray, tell me." "Well, there's no reason why I should, but I will. I would try to convert my women's organs into men's organs. It is a man's country." "Speak more plainly." "Oh, it's plain enough. If you attempt to pass through Ifdon without a sorb, you are simply committing suicide. And that Magn, too, is worse than useless. You probably know what you are talking about, Osiax. But what do you advise me to do?" She negligently pointed to the light-emitting stone lying on the ground. "There is the solution. If you hold that druid to your organs for a good while, perhaps it will start the change, and perhaps nature will do the rest during the night. I promise nothing." Osiax now really turned her back on Maskell. He considered for a few minutes, and then walked over and to where the stone was lying, and took it in his hand. It was a pebble, the size of a hen's egg, radiant with crimson light, as though red hot, and throwing out a continuous shower of small blood-red sparks. Finally deciding that Osiax's advice was good, he applied the druid first to his magn, and then to his breve. He experienced a cauterizing sensation, a feeling of healing pain. Chapter 9. Osiax Maskell's second day on Tormance dawned. Branchspell was already above the horizon when he awoke. He was instantly aware that his organs had changed during the night. His fleshy breve was altered into an eye-like sorb. His maggon had swelled and developed into a third arm, springing from the breast. The arm gave him at once a sense of greater physical security. But with the sorb, he was obliged to experiment before he could grasp its function. As he lay there in the white sunlight, opening and shutting each of his 3 eyes in turn, he found that the 2 lower ones served his understanding, the upper one his will. That is to say, with the lower eyes he saw things in clear detail, but without personal interest. With the sorb, he saw nothing as self-existent. Everything appeared as an object of importance or non-importance to his own needs. Rather puzzled as to how this would turn out, he got up and looked about him. He had slept out of sight of Osiax. He was anxious to learn if she were still on the spot, but before going to ascertain, he made up his mind to bathe in the river. It was a glorious morning. The hot white sun already began to glare, but its heat was tempered by a strong wind which whistled through the trees. A host of fantastic clouds filled the sky. They looked like animals and were always changing shape. The ground, as well as the leaves and branches of the forest trees, still held traces of heavy dew or rain during the night. A poignantly sweet smell of nature entered his nostrils. His pain was quiescent, and his spirits were high. Before he bathed, he viewed the mountains of the Ifton Marest. In the morning sunlight, they stood out pictorially. He guessed that they were from 5,000 to 6,000 feet high. The lofty, irregular, castellated line seemed like the walls of a magic city. The cliffs fronting him were composed of gaudy rocks, vermilion, emerald, yellow, ulfire, and black. As he gazed at them, his heart began to beat like a slow, heavy drum, and he thrilled all over. Indescribable hopes, aspirations, and emotions came over him. It was more than the conquest of a new world which he felt. It was something different. He bathed and drank, and as he was reclothing himself, Osiax strolled indolently up. He could now perceive the color of her skin. It was a vivid yet delicate mixture of carmine, white, and jade. The effect was startlingly unearthly. With these new colors, she looked like a genuine representative of a strange planet. Her frame also had something curious about it. The curves were womanly. The bones were characteristically female, yet all seemed somehow to express a daring, masculine underlying will. The commanding eye on her forehead set the same puzzle in plainer language. Its bold, domineering egotism was shot with undergleams of sex and softness. She came to the river's edge and reviewed him from top to toe. "Now you are built more like a man," she said, in her lovely, lingering voice. "You see, the experiment was successful," he answered, smiling gaily. Osiax continued looking him over. "Did some woman give you that ridiculous robe?" "A woman did give it to me," dropping his smile. "But I saw nothing ridiculous in the gift at the time, and I don't now. I think I'd look better in it." As she drawled the words, she began stripping off the skin, which suited her form so well, and motioned to him to exchange garments. He obeyed rather shamefacedly, for he realized that the proposed exchange was in fact more appropriate to his sex. He found the skin a freer dress. Osiax in her drapery appeared more dangerously feminine to him. "I don't want you to receive gifts at all from other women," she remarked slowly. "Why not? What can I be to you? I have been thinking about you during the night." Her voice was retarded, scornful, Viola-like. She sat down on the trunk of a fallen tree and looked away. "In what way?" She returned no answer to his question, but began to pull off pieces of the bark. "Last night you were so contemptuous. Last night is not today. Do you always walk through the world with your head over your shoulder?" It was now Mascul's turn to be silent. Still, if you have male instincts, as I suppose you have, you can't go on resisting me forever. But this is preposterous, said Mascul, opening his eyes wide. Granted that you are a beautiful woman, we can't be quite so primeval. Oseax sighed and rose to her feet. It doesn't matter. I can wait. From that, I gather that you intend to make the journey in my society. I have no objection. In fact, I shall be glad, but only on condition that you drop this language. Yet you do think me beautiful. Why shouldn't I think so, if it is the fact? I fail to see what that has to do with my feelings. Bring it to an end, Oseax. You will find plenty of men to admire and love you. At that, she blazed up. Does love pick and choose, you fool? Do you imagine I am so hard put to it that I have to hunt for lovers? Is not Crim Typhon waiting for me at this very moment? Very well. I am sorry to have hurt your feelings. Now carry the temptation no farther, for it is a temptation where a lovely woman is concerned. I am not my own master. I'm not proposing anything so very hateful, am I? Why do you humiliate me so? Mascul put his hands behind his back. I repeat, I am not my own master. Then who is your master? Yesterday I saw Surtur, and from today I am serving him. Did you speak with him? She asked curiously. I did. Tell me what he said. No, I can't. I won't. But whatever he said, his beauty was more tormenting than yours, Oseax. And that's why I can look at you in cold blood. Did Surtur forbid you to be a man? Mascul frowned. Is love such a manly sport, then? I should have thought it effeminate. It doesn't matter. You won't always be so boyish. But don't try my patience too far. Let us talk about something else. And above all, let us get on our road. She suddenly broke into a laugh so rich, sweet, and enchanting that he grew half inflamed and half wished to catch her body in his arms. Oh, Mascul, Mascul, what a fool you are. In what way am I a fool? He demanded, scowling not at her words but at his own weakness. Isn't the whole world the handiwork of innumerable pairs of lovers? And yet you think yourself above all that. You try to fly away from nature, but where will you find a hole to hide yourself in? Besides beauty, I now credit you with a second quality, persistence. Read me well, and then it is natural law that you'll think twice and 3 times before throwing me away. And now before we go, we had better eat. Eat? Said Mascul thoughtfully. Don't you eat? Is food in the same category as love? What food is it? Fish from the river. Mascul recollected his promise to Joywind. At the same time, he felt hungry. Is there nothing milder? She pulled her mouth scornfully. You came through Pooling Dread, didn't you? All the people there are the same. They think life is to be looked at and not lived. Now that you are visiting Ifdawn, you will have to change your notions. Go catch your fish, he returned, pulling down his brows. The broad, clear waters flowed past them with swelling undulations from the direction of the mountains. Oseax knelt down on the bank and peered into the depths. Presently, her look became tense and concentrated. She dipped her hand in and pulled out some sort of little monster. It was more like a reptile than a fish, with its scaly plates and teeth. She threw it on the ground, and it started crawling about. Suddenly she darted all her will into her sorb. The creature leaped into the air and fell down dead. She picked up a sharp-edged slate and with it removed the scales and entrails. During this operation, her hands and garment became stained with the light scarlet blood. Find the Druid, Mascul, she said with a lazy smile. You had it last night. He searched for it. It was hard to locate, for its rays had grown dull and feeble in the sunlight. But at last he found it. Osiax placed it in the interior of the monster and left the body lying on the ground. While it's cooking, I'll wash some of this blood away, which frightens you so much. Have you never seen blood before? Maskell gazed at her in perplexity. The old paradox came back, the contrasting sexual characteristics in her person. Her bold, masterful, masculine egotism of manner seemed quite incongruous with the fascinating and disturbing femininity of her voice. A startling idea flashed into his mind. In your country, I'm told there is an act of will called absorbing. What is that? She held her red, dripping hands away from her draperies and uttered a delicious, clashing laugh. You think I am half a man? Answer my question. I'm a woman through and through, Maskell, to the marrow bone. But that's not to say I have never absorbed males, and that means new strings for my harp, Maskell. A wider range of passions, a stormier heart. For you, yes. But for them, I don't know. The victims don't describe their experiences, probably unhappiness of some sort, if they still know anything. This is a fearful business, he exclaimed, regarding her gloomily. One would think, if Dawn, a land of devils. Osiax gave a beautiful sneer as she took a step toward the river. Better men than you, better in every sense of the word, are walking about with foreign wills inside them. You may be as moral as you like, Maskell, but the fact remains, animals were made to be eaten, and simple natures were made to be absorbed. And human rights count for nothing. She had bent over the river's edge to wash her arms and hands, but glanced up over her shoulder to answer his remark. They do count, but we only regard a man as human for just as long as he's able to hold his own with others. The flesh was soon cooked, and they breakfasted in silence. Maskell cast heavy, doubtful glances from time to time toward his companion. Whether it was due to the strange quality of the food or to his long abstention, he did not know. But the meal tasted nauseous and even cannibalistic. He ate little, and the moment he got up, he felt defiled. Let me bury this Druid where I can find it some other time, said Osiax. On the next occasion, though, I shall have no Maskell with me to shock. Now we have to take to the river. They stepped off the land onto the water. It flowed against them with a sluggish current, but the opposition, instead of hindering them, had the contrary effect. It caused them to exert themselves, and they moved faster. They climbed the river in this way for several miles. The exercise gradually improved the circulation of Maskell's blood, and he began to look at things in a far more way. The hot sunshine, the diminished wind, the cheerful, marvelous cloud scenery, the quiet, crystal forests, all was soothing and delightful. They approached nearer and nearer to the gaily painted heights of Ifdawn. There was something enigmatic to him in those bright walls. He was attracted by them, yet felt a sort of awe. They looked real, but at the same time very supernatural. If one could see the portrait of a ghost, painted with a hard, firm outline, in substantial colors, the feelings produced by such a sight would be exactly similar to Maskell's impressions as he studied the Ifdawn precipices. He broke the long silence. Those mountains have most extraordinary shapes. All the lines are straight and perpendicular, no slopes or curves. She walked backward on the water in order to face him. That's typical of Ifdawn. Nature is all hammer blows with us, nothing soft and gradual. I hear you, but I don't understand you. All over the Marist you'll find patches of ground, plunging down or rushing up. Trees grow fast. Women and men don't think twice before acting. One may call Ifdawn a place of quick decisions. Maskell was impressed. A fresh, wild, primitive land. How is it where you come from? Asked Osiax. Oh, mine is a decrepit world, where nature takes 100 years to move a foot of solid land. Men and animals go about in flocks. Originality is a lost habit. Are there women there, as with you, and not very differently formed? Do they love? He laughed, so much so that it has changed the dress, speech, and thoughts of the whole sex. Probably they are more beautiful than I. No, I think not, said Maskul. There was another rather long silence as they traveled unsteadily onward. What is your business in Ifdawn? Demanded Oseax suddenly. He hesitated over his answer. Can you grasp that it's possible to have an aim right in front of one, so big that one can't see it as a whole? She stole a long, inquisitive look at him. What sort of aim? A moral aim. Are you proposing to set the world right? I propose nothing. I am waiting. Don't wait too long, for time doesn't wait, especially in Ifdawn. Something will happen, said Maskul. Oseax threw a subtle smile. So you have no special destination in the Marist? No, and if you'll permit me, I will come home with you. Singular man, she said, with a short, thrilling laugh. That's what I have been offering all the time. Of course you will come home with me. As for Crim-Typhon, you mentioned that name before. Who is he? Oh, my lover, or as you would say, my husband. This doesn't improve matters, said Maskul. It leaves them exactly where they were. We merely have to remove him. We are certainly misunderstanding each other, said Maskul, quite startled. Do you by any chance imagine that I am making a compact with you? You will do nothing against your will, but you have promised to come home with me. Tell me, how do you remove husbands in Ifdawn? Either you or I must kill him. He eyed her for a full minute. Now we are passing from folly to insanity. Not at all, replied Oseax. It is the too sad truth. And when you have seen Crim-Typhon, you will realize it. I'm aware I am on a strange planet, said Maskul slowly, where all sorts of unheard-of things may happen, and where the very laws of morality may be different. Still, as far as I am concerned, murder is murder, and I'll have no more to do with a woman who wants to make use of me. To get rid of her husband. You think me wicked? Demanded Oseax steadily. Or mad? Then you had better leave me, Maskul. Only what? You wish to be consistent, don't you? Leave all other mad and wicked people as well. Then you'll find it easier to reform the rest. Maskul frowned, but said nothing. Well, demanded Oseax with a half-smile. I'll come with you, and I'll see Crim-Typhon, if only to warn him. Oseax broke into a cascade of rich, feminine laughter, but whether at the image conjured up by Maskul's last words, or from some other cause, he did not know. The conversation dropped. At a distance of a couple of miles from the now towering cliffs, the river made a sharp, right-angled turn to the west, and was no longer of use to them on their journey. Maskul stared up doubtfully. It's a stiff climb for a hot morning. Let's rest here a little, said she, indicating a smooth, flat island of black rock, standing up just out of the water in the middle of the river. They accordingly went to it, and Maskul sat down. Oseax, however, standing graceful and erect, turned her face toward the cliffs opposite, and uttered a piercing and peculiar call. What is that for? She did not answer. After waiting a minute, she repeated the call. Maskul now saw a large bird detach itself from the top of one of the precipices and sail slowly down toward them. It was followed by two others. The flight of these birds was exceedingly slow and clumsy. What are they? He asked. She still returned no answer but smiled rather peculiarly and sat down beside him. Before many minutes, he was able to distinguish the shapes and colors of the flying monsters. They were not birds, but creatures with long, snake-like bodies and 10 reptilian legs apiece, terminating in fins which acted as wings. The bodies were of bright blue. The legs and fins were yellow. They were flying, without haste, but in a somewhat ominous fashion, straight toward them. He could make out a long, thin spike projecting from each of the heads. "They are Shrokes," explained Osiax at last. "If you want to know their intention, I'll tell you. To make a meal of us. First of all, their spikes will pierce us, and then their mouths, which are really suckers, will drain us dry of blood. Pretty thoroughly, too. There are no half measures with Shrokes. They are toothless beasts, so don't eat flesh." "As you show such admirable sang-froid," said Mascull dryly, "I take it there's no particular danger." Nevertheless, he instinctively tried to get onto his feet and failed. A new form of paralysis was chaining him to the ground. "Are you trying to get up?" asked Osiax smoothly. "Well, yes, but those cursed reptiles seem to be nailing me down to the rock with their wills. May I ask if you had any special object in view in waking them up?" "I assure you the danger is quite real, Mascull. Instead of talking and asking questions, you had much better see what you can do with your will." "I seem to have no will, unfortunately." Osiax was seized with a paroxysm of laughter, but it was still rich and beautiful. "It's obvious you aren't a very heroic protector, Mascull. It seems I must play the man, and you the woman. I expected better things of your big body. Why, my husband would send those creatures dancing all around the sky by way of a joke before disposing of them. Now watch me. 2 of the 3 I'll kill. The 3rd we will ride home on. Which one shall we keep?" The Shrokes continued their slow, wobbling flight toward them. Their bodies were of huge size. They produced in Mascull the same sensation of loathing as insects did. He instinctively understood that as they hunted with their wills, there was no necessity for them to possess a swift motion. "Choose which you please," he said shortly. "They are equally objectionable to me." "Then I'll choose the leader, as it is presumably the most energetic animal. Watch now." She stood upright, and her sorb suddenly blazed with fire. Mascull felt something snap inside his brain. His limbs were free once more. The 2 monsters in the rear staggered and darted head foremost toward the earth, one after the other. He watched them crash on the ground and then lie motionless. The leader still came toward them, but he fancied that its flight was altered in character. It was no longer menacing, but tame and unwilling. Osiax guided it with her will to the mainland shore opposite their island rock. Its vast bulk lay there extended, awaiting her pleasure. They immediately crossed the water. Mascull viewed the Shroke at close quarters. It was about 30 feet long. Its bright-colored skin was shining, slippery, and leathery. A mane of black hair covered its long neck. Its face was awesome and unnatural, with its carnivorous eyes, frightful stiletto, and blood-sucking cavity. There were true fins on its back and tail. "Have you a good seat?" asked Osiax, patting the creature's flank. "As I have to steer, let me jump on first." She pulled up her gown, then climbed up and sat astride the animal's back, just behind the mane, which she clutched. Between her and the fin there was just room for Mascull. He grasped the 2 flanks with his outer hands. His 3rd, new arm pressed against Osiax's back, and for additional security he was compelled to encircle her waist with it. Directly he did so, he realized that he had been tricked, and that this ride had been planned for one purpose only, to inflame his desires. The 3rd arm possessed a function of its own, of which hitherto he had been ignorant. It was a developed, Magn. But the stream of love which was communicated to it was no longer pure and noble. It was boiling, passionate, and torturing. He gritted his teeth and kept quiet. But Osiax had not plotted the adventure to remain unconscious of his feelings. She looked around with a golden, triumphant smile. "The ride will last some time, so hold on well." Her voice was soft, like a flute, but rather malicious. Maskell grinned and said nothing. He dared not remove his arm. The Shroak straddled onto its legs. It jerked itself forward and rose slowly and uncouthly in the air. They began to paddle upward toward the painted cliffs. The motion was sway in 86-ing, rocking and sickening. The contact of the brute's slimy skin was disgusting. All this, however, was merely background to Maskell, as he sat there with closed eyes, holding on to Osiax. In the front and center of his consciousness was the knowledge that he was gripping a fair woman, and that her flesh was responding to his touch like a lovely harp. They climbed up and up. He opened his eyes and ventured to look around him. By this time they were already level with the top of the outer rampart of precipices. There now came in sight a wild archipelago of islands, with jagged outlines emerging from a sea of air. The islands were mountain summits, or more accurately speaking, the country was a high tableland, fissured everywhere by narrow and apparently bottomless cracks. These cracks were in some cases like canals, in others like lakes, in others merely holes in the ground, closed in all round. The perpendicular sides of the islands, that is, the upper visible parts of the innumerable cliff faces, were of bare rock, gaudily colored, but the level surfaces were a tangle of wild plant life. The taller trees alone were distinguishable from the Shroak's back. They were of different shapes and did not look ancient. They were slender and swaying, but did not appear very graceful. They looked tough, wiry, and savage. As Maskell continued to explore the landscape, he forgot Osiax and his passion. Other strange feelings came to the front. The morning was gay and bright. The sun scorched down, quickly changing clouds sailed across the sky. The earth was vivid, wild, and lonely, yet he experienced no aesthetic sensations. He felt nothing but an intense longing for action and possession. When he looked at anything, he immediately wanted to deal with it. The atmosphere of the land seemed not free, but sticky. Attraction and repulsion were its constituents. Apart from this wish to play a personal part in what was going on around and beneath him, the scenery had no significance for him. So preoccupied was he that his arm partly released its clasp. Osiax turned around to gaze at him. Whether or not she was satisfied with what she saw, she uttered a low laugh, like a peculiar chord. "Cold again so quickly, Maskell?" "What do you want?" he asked absently, still looking over the side. "It's extraordinary how drawn I feel to all this. You wish to take a hand. I wish to get down. Oh, we have a good way to go yet. So you really feel different? Different from what? What are you talking about?" said Maskell, still lost in abstraction. Osiax laughed again. "It would be strange if we couldn't make a man of you, for the material is excellent." After that, she turned her back once more. The air islands differed from water islands in another way. They were not on a plain surface but sloped upward, like a succession of broken terraces, as the journey progressed. The Shroak had hitherto been flying well above the ground, but now, when a new line of towering cliffs confronted them, Osiax did not urge the beast upward, but caused it to enter a narrow canyon, which intersected the mountains like a channel. They were instantly plunged into deep shade. The canal was not above 30 feet wide, The wall stretched upward on both sides for many hundred feet. It was as cool as an ice chamber. When Maskell attempted to plumb the chasm with his eyes, he saw nothing but black obscurity. "What is at the bottom?" he asked. "Death for you, if you go to look for it. We know that. I mean, is there any kind of life down there?" "Not that I have ever heard of," said Oseax. "But of course all things are possible. I think very likely there is life." He returned thoughtfully. Her ironical laugh sounded out of the gloom. "Shall we go down and see? You find that amusing?" "No, not that. What I do find amusing is the big stranger with the beard, who is so keenly interested in everything except himself." Maskell then laughed too. "I happen to be the only thing in Torments which is not a novelty for me." "Yes, but I am a novelty for you." The channel went zigzagging its way through the belly of the mountain, and all the time they were gradually rising. "At least I have heard nothing like your voice before," said Maskell, who, since he had no longer anything to look at, was at last ready for conversation. "What's the matter with my voice? It's all that I can distinguish of you now. That's why I mentioned it. Isn't it clear? Don't I speak distinctly?" "Oh, it's clear enough, but it's inappropriate." "Inappropriate?" "I won't explain further," said Maskell. "But whether you are speaking or laughing, your voice is by far the loveliest and strangest instrument I have ever listened to. And yet I repeat, it is inappropriate." "You mean that my nature doesn't correspond?" He was just considering his reply when their talk was abruptly broken off by a huge and terrifying, but not very loud sound rising up from the gulf directly underneath them. It was a low, grinding, roaring thunder. "The ground is rising under us," cried Oseax. "Shall we escape?" She made no answer, but urged the Shroke's flight upward at such a steep gradient that they retained their seats with difficulty. The floor of the canyon, upheaved by some mighty subterranean force, could be heard and almost felt coming up after them, like a gigantic landslip in the wrong direction. The cliffs cracked, and fragments began to fall. 100 awful noises filled the air, growing louder and louder each second, splitting, hissing, cracking, grinding, booming, exploding, roaring. When they had still 50 feet or so to go to reach the top, a sort of dark, indefinite sea of broken rocks and soil appeared under their feet, ascending rapidly with irresistible might, accompanied by the most horrible noises. The canal was filled up for 200 yards. Before and behind them, millions of tons of solid matter seemed to be raised. The Shroke in its ascent was caught by the uplifted debris. Beast and riders experienced in that moment all the horrors of an earthquake. They were rolled violently over and thrown among the rocks and dirt. All was thunder, instability, motion, confusion. Before they had time to realize their position, they were in the sunlight. The upheaval still continued. In another minute or two, the valley floor had formed a new mountain, 100 feet or more higher than the old. Then its movement cessed suddenly. Every noise stopped, as if by magic. Not a rock moved. Oseax and Maskell picked themselves up and examined themselves for cuts and bruises. The Shroke lay on its side, panting violently and sweating with fright. "That was a nasty affair," said Maskell, flicking the dirt off his person. Oseax staunched a cut on her chin with a corner of her robe. "It might have been far worse. I mean, it's bad enough to come up, but it's death to go down, and that happens just as often. Whatever induces you to live in such a country?" "I don't know, Maskell. Habit, I suppose. I've often thought of moving out of it. A good deal must be forgiven you for having to spend your life in a place like this, where one is obviously never safe from one minute to another." You will learn by degrees, she answered, smiling. She looked hard at the monster, and it got heavily to its feet. Get on again, Maskell, she directed, climbing back to her perch. We haven't too much time to waste. He obeyed. They resumed their interrupted flight, this time over the mountains and in full sunlight. Maskell settled down again to his thoughts. The peculiar atmosphere of the country continued to soak into his brain. His will became so restless and uneasy that merely to sit there in inactivity was a torture. He could scarcely endure not to be doing something. How secretive you are, Maskell, said Oceax, quietly, without turning her head. What secrets? What do you mean? Oh, I know perfectly well what's passing inside you. Now I think it wouldn't be amiss to ask you, is friendship still enough? Oh, don't ask me anything, growled Maskell. I've far too many problems in my head already. I only wish I could answer some of them. He stared stonily at the landscape. The beast was winging its way toward a distant mountain of singular shape. It was an enormous natural quadrilateral pyramid, rising in great terraces and terminating in a broad, flat top, on which what looked like green snow still lingered. What mountain is that? He asked. Discorn, the highest point in Ifdawn. Are we going there? Why should we go there? But if you were going on farther, it might be worth your while to pay a visit to the top. It commands the whole land as far as the Sinking Sea and Swaylone's Island and beyond. You can also see Alpane from it. That's a sight I mean to see before I have finished. Do you, Maskell? She turned around and put her hand on his wrist. Stay with me, and one day we'll go to Discorn together. He grunted unintelligibly. There were no signs of human existence in the country under their feet. While Maskell was still grimly regarding it, a large tract of forest not far ahead, bearing many trees and rocks, suddenly subsided with an awful roar and crashed down into an invisible gulf. What was solid land one minute became a clean-cut chasm the next. He jumped violently up with the shock. This is frightful. Oceax remained unmoved. Why, life here must be absolutely impossible, he went on, when he had somewhat recovered himself. A man would need nerves of steel. Is there no means at all of foreseeing a catastrophe like this? Oh, I suppose we wouldn't be alive if there weren't, replied Oceax, with composure. We are more or less clever at it, but that doesn't prevent our often getting caught. You had better teach me the signs. We'll have many things to go over together, and among them, I expect, will be whether we are to stay in the land at all. But first, let us get home. How far is it now? It is right in front of you, said Oceax, pointing with her forefinger. You can see it. He followed the direction of the finger, and after a few questions, made out the spot she was indicating. It was a broad peninsula, about 2 miles distant. 3 of its sides rose sheer out of a lake of air, the bottom of which was invisible. Its 4th was a bottleneck, joining it to the mainland. It was overgrown with bright vegetation, distinct in the brilliant atmosphere. A single tall tree, shooting up in the middle of the peninsula, dwarfed everything else. It was wide and shady with sea-green leaves. I wonder if Crim-Typhon is there, remarked Oceax. Can I see 2 figures, or am I mistaken? I also see something, said Maskell. In 20 minutes they were directly above the peninsula, at a height of about 50 feet. The Shroak slackened speed and came to earth on the mainland, exactly at the gateway of the isthmus. They both descended, Maskell with aching thighs. What shall we do with the monster? Asked Oceax. Without waiting for a suggestion, she patted its hideous face with her hand. Fly away home. I may want you some other time. It gave a stupid grunt, elevated itself on its legs again, and after half running, half flying for a few yards, rose awkwardly into the air and paddled away in the same direction from which they had come. They watched it out of sight, and then Osiak started to cross the neck of land, followed by Maskell. Branch spells' white rays beat down on them with pitiless force. The sky had by degrees become cloudless, and the wind had dropped entirely. The ground was a rich riot of vividly colored ferns, shrubs, and grasses. Through these could be seen here and there the golden chalky soil, and occasionally a glittering white metallic boulder. Everything looked extraordinary and barbaric. Maskell was at last walking in the weird Ifton Marist, which had created such strange feelings in him when seen from a distance. And now he felt no wonder or curiosity at all, but only desired to meet human beings. So intense had grown his will. He longed to test his powers on his fellow creatures, and nothing else seemed of the least importance to him. On the peninsula, all was coolness and delicate shade. It resembled a large copse, about 2 acres in extent. In the heart of the tangle of small trees and undergrowth was a partially cleared space. Perhaps the roots of the giant tree growing in the center had killed off the smaller fry all around it. By the side of the tree sparkled a little bubbling fountain, whose water was iron red. The precipices on all sides, overhung with thorns, flowers, and creepers, invested the enclosure with an air of wild and charming seclusion. A mythological mountain god might have dwelt here. Maskell's restless eye left everything, to fall on the 2 men who formed the center of the picture. One was reclining, in the ancient Grecian fashion of banqueters, on a tall couch of mosses sprinkled with flowers. He rested on one arm and was eating a kind of plum with calm enjoyment. A pile of these plums lay on the couch beside him. The overspreading branches of the tree completely sheltered him from the sun. His small, boyish form was clad in a rough skin, leaving his limbs naked. Maskell could not tell from his face whether he were a young boy or a grown man. The features were smooth, soft, and childish. Their expression was seraphically tranquil, but his violet upper eye was sinister and adult. His skin was of the color of yellow ivory. His long, curling hair matched his sorb. It was violet. The second man was standing erect before the other, a few feet away from him. He was short and muscular. His face was broad, bearded, and rather commonplace. But there was something terrible about his appearance. The features were distorted by a deep-seated look of pain, despair, and horror. Osiak, without pausing, strolled lightly and lazily up to the outermost shadows of the tree, some distance from the couch. "We have met with an uplift," she remarked carelessly, looking toward the youth. He eyed her, but said nothing. "How is your plant man getting on?" Her tone was artificial but extremely beautiful. While waiting for an answer, she sat down on the ground, her legs gracefully thrust under her body, and pulled down the skirt of her robe. Maskell remained standing just behind her, with crossed arms. There was silence for a minute. "Why don't you answer your mistress, Sature?" said the boy on the couch in a calm, treble voice. The man addressed did not alter his expression, but replied in a strangled tone, "I am getting on very well, Okeax. There are already buds on my feet. Tomorrow I hope to take root." Maskell felt a rising storm inside him. He was perfectly aware that although these words were uttered by Sature, they were being dictated by the boy. "What he says is quite true," remarked the latter. "Tomorrow roots will reach the ground, and in a few days they ought to be well established. Then I shall set to work to convert his arms into branches and his fingers into leaves. It will take longer to transform his head into a crown, but still I hope. In fact, I can almost promise that within a month you and I, Oseax, will be plucking and enjoying fruit from this new and remarkable tree. I love these natural experiments, he concluded, putting out his hand for another plum. They thrill me. This must be a joke, said Maskell, taking a step forward. The youth looked at him serenely. He made no reply, but Maskell felt as if he were being thrust backward by an iron hand on his throat. The morning's work is now concluded, Satur. Come here again after Bloodsombre. After tonight, you will remain here permanently, I expect. So you had better set to work to clear a patch of ground for your roots. Never forget, however fresh and charming these plants appear to you now, in the future they will be your deadliest rivals and enemies. Now, you may go. The man limped painfully away, across the isthmus, out of sight. Oseax yawned. Maskell pushed his way forward, as if against a wall. Are you joking, or are you a devil? I am Crim-Typhon. I never joke. For that epithet of yours, I will devise a new punishment for you. The duel of wills commenced without ceremony. Oseax got up, stretched her beautiful limbs, smiled, and prepared herself to witness the struggle between her old lover and her new. Crim-Typhon smiled too. He reached out his hand for more fruit, but did not eat it. Maskell's self-control broke down and he dashed at the boy, choking with red fury. His beard wagged and his face was crimson. When he realized with whom he had to deal, Crim-Typhon left off smiling, slipped off the couch, and threw a terrible and malignant glare into his sorb. Maskell staggered. He gathered together all the brute force of his will, and by sheer weight, continued his advance. The boy shrieked and ran behind the couch, trying to get away. His opposition suddenly collapsed. Maskell stumbled forward, recovered himself, and then vaulted clear over the high pile of mosses to get at his antagonist. He fell on top of him with all his bulk. Grasping his throat, he pulled his little head completely around so that the neck was broken. Crim-Typhon immediately died. The corpse lay underneath the tree with its face upturned. Maskell viewed it attentively, and as he did so, an expression of awe and wonder came into his own countenance. In the moment of death, Crim-Typhon's face had undergone a startling and even shocking alteration. Its personal character had wholly vanished, giving place to a vulgar, grinning mask which expressed nothing. He did not have to search his mind long to remember where he had seen the brother of that expression. It was identical with that on the face of the apparition at the séance, after Crag had dealt with it. Chapter 10. T-Domen Oseax sat down carelessly on the couch of mosses and began eating the plums. "You see, you had to kill him, Maskell," she said, in a rather quizzical voice. He came away from the corpse and regarded her, still red and still breathing hard. "It's no joking matter. You especially ought to keep quiet." "Why?" "Because he was your husband. You think I ought to show grief when I feel none?" "Don't pretend, woman." Oseax smiled. "From your manner, one would think you were accusing me of some crime." Maskell literally snorted at her words. "What? You live with filth? You live in the arms of a morbid monstrosity, and then—" "Oh, now I grasp it," she said, in a tone of perfect detachment. "I'm glad. Well, Maskell," she proceeded after a pause, "and who gave you the right to rule my conduct? Am I not mistress of my own person?" He looked at her with disgust, but said nothing. There was another long interval of silence. "I never loved him," said Oseax at last, looking at the ground. "That makes it all the worse. What does all this mean? What do you want?" Nothing from you. Absolutely nothing. Thank heaven." She gave a hard laugh. "You come here with your foreign preconceptions and expect us all to bow down to them. What preconceptions? Just because Crim Typhon's sports are strange to you, you murder him, and you would like to murder me. Sports? That diabolical cruelty? Oh, you're sentimental," said Oseax contemptuously. "Why do you need to make such a fuss over that man? Life is life, all the world over, and one form is as good as another. He was only to be made a tree, like a million other trees. If they can endure the life, why can't he? And this is if-dawn morality." Oseax began to grow angry. "It's you who have peculiar ideas. You rave about the beauty of flowers and trees. You think them divine. But when it's a question of taking on this divine, fresh, pure, enchanting loveliness yourself in your own person, it immediately becomes a cruel and wicked degradation. Here we have a strange riddle, in my opinion. Oseax, you're a beautiful, heartless, wild beast, nothing more. If you weren't a woman, well," curling her lip, "let us hear what would happen if I weren't a woman." Maskell bit his nails. "It doesn't matter. I can't touch you. Though there's certainly not the difference of a hair between you and your boy husband. For this you may thank my foreign preconceptions. Farewell." He turned to go. Oseax's eyes slanted at him through their long lashes. "Where are you off to, Maskell?" "That's a matter of no importance. For wherever I go, it must be a change for the better. You walking whirlpools of crime." "Wait a minute, I only want to say this. To say, Blood Somber is just our starting, and you'd better stay here till the afternoon. We can quickly put that body out of sight. And as you seem to detest me so much, the place is big enough we needn't talk or even see each other. I don't wish to breathe the same air. Singular man." She was sitting erect and motionless, like a beautiful statue. "And what of your wonderful interview with Surtur, and all the undone things which you set out to do? You aren't the one I shall speak to about that. But," he eyed her meditatively, "while I'm still here, you can tell me this. What's the meaning of the expression on that corpse's face? Is that another crime, Maskell? All dead people look like that. Ought they not to? I once heard it called Crystal Man's face. Why not? We are all daughters and sons of Crystal Man. It is doubtless the family resemblance. It has also been told me that Surtur and Crystal Man are one and the same. You have wise and truthful acquaintances. Then how could it have been Surtur whom I saw?" said Maskell more to himself than to her. That apparition was something quite different. She dropped her mocking manner, and sliding imperceptibly toward him, gently pulled his arm. "You see, we have to talk. Sit down beside me and ask me your questions. I'm not excessively smart, but I'll try to be of assistance." Maskell permitted himself to be dragged down with soft violence. She bent toward him, as if confidentially, and contrived that her sweet, cool, feminine breath should fan his cheek. "Aren't you here to alter the evil to the good, Maskell? Then what does it matter who sent you? What can you possibly know of good and evil? Are you only instructing the initiated? Who am I to instruct anybody? However, you're quite right. I wish to do what I can, not because I am qualified, but because I am here." Oseax's voice dropped to a whisper. "You're a giant, both in body and soul. What you want to do, you can do. Is that your honest opinion, or are you flattering me for your own ends?" She sighed. "Don't you see how difficult you are making the conversation? Let's talk about your work, not about ourselves." Maskell suddenly noticed a strange blue light glowing in the northern sky. It was from Alpane, but Alpane itself was behind the hills. While he was observing it, a peculiar wave of self-denial, of a disquieting nature passed through him. He looked at Oseax, and it struck him for the first time that he was being unnecessarily brutal to her. He had forgotten that she was a woman, and defenseless. "Won't you stay?" she asked all of a sudden, quite openly and frankly. "Yes, I think I'll stay," he replied slowly. "And another thing, Oseax, if I've misjudged your character, pray forgive me. I'm a hasty, passionate man. There are enough easygoing men. Hard knocks are a good medicine for vicious hearts. And you didn't misjudge my character as far as you went. Only every woman has more than one character. Don't you know that?" During the pause that followed, a snapping of twigs was heard, and both looked around, startled. They saw a woman stepping slowly across the neck that separated them from the mainland. "Taidomin," muttered Oseax, in a vexed, frightened voice. She immediately moved away from Maskull and stood up. The newcomer was of middle height, very slight and graceful. She was no longer quite young. Her face wore the composure of a woman who knows her way about the world. It was intensely pale, and under its quiescence there just was a glimpse of something strange and dangerous. It was curiously alluring, though not exactly beautiful. Her hair was clustering and boyish, reaching only to the neck. It was of a strange indigo color. She was quaintly attired in a tunic and breeches, pieced together from the square, blue-green plates of some reptile. Her small, ivory-white breasts were exposed. Her sorb was black and sad, rather contemplative. Without once glancing up at Oseax and Maskull, she quietly glided straight toward Crim-Typhon's corpse. When she arrived within a few feet of it, she stopped and looked down, with arms folded. Oseax drew Maskull a little away and whispered, "It's Crim-Typhon's other wife, who lives under Discorn. She's a most dangerous woman. Be careful what you say. If she asks you to do anything, refuse it outright." The poor soul looks harmless enough. Yes, she does. But the poor soul is quite capable of swallowing up Crag himself. Now, play the man. The murmur of their voices seemed to attract Tideman's notice, for she now slowly turned her eyes toward them. "Who killed him?" she demanded. Her voice was so soft, low, and refined that Maskull hardly was able to catch the words. The sounds, however, lingered in his ears, and curiously enough seemed to grow stronger instead of fainter. Oseax whispered, "Don't say a word. Leave it all to me." Then she swung her body around and to face Tiedemann squarely, and said aloud, "I killed him." Tiedemann's words by this time were ringing in Maskull's head like an actual physical sound. There was no question of being able to ignore them. He had to make an open confession of his act, whatever the consequences might be. Quietly taking Oseax by the shoulder and putting her behind him, he said in a low but perfectly distinct voice, "It was I that killed Crim-Typhon." Oseax looked both haughty and frightened. "Maskull says that so as to shield me, as he thinks. I require no shield, Maskull. I killed him, Taidomin. I believe you, Oseax. You did murder him, not with your own strength, for you brought this man along for the purpose." Maskull took a couple of steps toward Tiedemann. "It's of little consequence who killed him, for he's better dead than alive, in my opinion. Still, I did it. Oseax had no hand in the affair." Tiedemann appeared not to hear him. She looked beyond him at Oseax musingly. "When you murdered him, didn't it occur to you that I would come here to find out?" "I never once thought of you," replied Oseax, with an angry laugh. "Do you really imagine that I carry your image with me wherever I go? If someone were to murder your lover here, what would you do?" "Lying hypocrite," Oseax spat out. "You never were in love with Crim-Typhon. You always hated me, and now you think it an excellent opportunity to make it good, now that Crim-Typhon's gone. For we both know he would have made a footstool of you if I had asked him. He worshipped me, but he laughed at you. He thought you ugly. Tydomin flashed a quick, gentle smile at Maskul. Is it necessary for you to listen to all this? Without question, and feeling it the right thing to do, he walked away out of earshot. Tydomin approached Osiax. Perhaps because my beauty fades and I'm no longer young, I needed him all the more. Osiax gave a kind of snarl. Well, he's dead, and that's the end of it. What are you going to do now, Tydomin? The other woman smiled faintly and rather pathetically. There's nothing left to do except mourn the dead. You won't grudge me that last office. Do you want to stay here? Demanded Osiax suspiciously. Yes, Osiax, dear. I wish to be alone. Then what is to become of us? I thought that you and your lover, what is his name? Maskul. I thought that perhaps you two would go to Discorn and spend Blood Somber at my home. Osiax called out aloud to Maskul. Will you come with me now to Discorn? If you wish, returned Maskul. Go first, Osiax. I must question your friend about Crim-Typhon's death. I won't keep him. Why don't you question me, rather? Demanded Osiax, looking up sharply. Tydomin gave the shadow of a smile. We know each other too well. Play no tricks, said Osiax, and she turned to go. Surely you must be dreaming, said Tydomin. That's the way, unless you want to walk over the cliffside. The path Osiax had chosen led across the isthmus. The direction which Tydomin proposed for her was over the edge of the precipice, into empty space, shaping. I must be mad, cried Osiax with a laugh, and she obediently followed the other's finger. She walked straight on toward the edge of the abyss, 20 paces away. Maskul pulled his beard around and wondered what she was doing. Tydomin remained standing with outstretched finger, watching her. Without hesitation, without slackening her step once, Osiax strolled on, and when she had reached the extreme end of the land, she still took one more step. Maskul saw her limbs wrench as she stumbled over the edge. Her body disappeared, and as it did so, an awful shriek sounded. Disillusionment had come to her an instant too late. He tore himself out of his stupor, rushed to the edge of the cliff, threw himself on the ground recklessly, and looked over. Osiax had vanished. He continued staring wildly down for several minutes, and then began to sob. Tydomin came up to him, and he got to his feet. The blood kept rushing to his face and leaving it again. It was some time before he could speak at all. Then he brought out the words with difficulty. You shall pay for this, Tydomin. But first I want to hear why you did it. Hadn't I cause? She asked, standing with downcast eyes. Was it pure fiendishness? It was for Crim-Typhon's sake. She had nothing to do with that death. I told you so. You are loyal to her, and I'm loyal to him. Loyal. You've made a terrible blunder. She wasn't my mistress. I killed Crim-Typhon for quite another reason. She had absolutely no part in it. Wasn't she your lover? Asked Tydomin slowly. You've made a terrible mistake, repeated Maskul. I killed him because he was a wild beast. She was as innocent of his death as you are. Tydomin's face took on a hard look. So you are guilty of 2 deaths. There was a dreadful silence. Why couldn't you believe me? Asked Maskul, who was pale and sweating painfully. Who gave you the right to kill him? Demanded Tydomin sternly. He said nothing, and perhaps did not hear her question. She sighed 2 or 3 times and began to stir restlessly. Since you murdered him, You must help me bury him. What's to be done? This is a most fearful crime. You art a most fearful man. Why did you come here to do all this? What are we to you? Unfortunately, you are right. Another pause ensued. It's no use standing here, said Tiedemann. Nothing can be done. You must come with me. Come with you? Where to? To Discorn. There's a burning lake on the far side of it. He always wished to be cast there after death. We can do that after Blood Sombre. In the meantime, we must take him home. You're a callous, heartless woman. Why should he be buried when that poor girl must remain unburied? You know that's out of the question, replied Tiedemann quietly. Maskell's eyes roamed about agitatedly, apparently seeing nothing. We must do something, she continued. I shall go. You can't wish to stay here alone. No, I couldn't stay here. And why should I want to? You want me to carry the corpse? He can't carry himself, and you murdered him. Perhaps it will ease your mind to carry it. Ease my mind, said Maskell rather stupidly. There's only one relief for remorse, and that's voluntary pain. And have you no remorse? He asked, fixing her with a heavy eye. These crimes are yours, Maskell, she said in a low but incisive voice. They walked over to Crim Typhon's body, and Maskell hoisted it onto his shoulders. It weighed heavier than he had thought. Tiedemann did not offer to assist him to adjust the ghastly burden. She crossed the isthmus, followed by Maskell. Their path lay through sunshine and shadow. Branchspell was blazing in a cloudless sky. The heat was insufferable. Streams of sweat coursed down his face, and the corpse seemed to grow heavier and heavier. Tiedemann always walked in front of him. His eyes were fastened in an unseeing stare on her white, womanish calves. He looked neither to right nor left. His features grew sullen. At the end of 10 minutes, he suddenly allowed his burden to slip off his shoulders onto the ground, where it lay sprawled every which way. He called out to Tiedemann. She quickly looked around. Come here. It has just occurred to me. He laughed. Why should I be carrying this corpse? And why should I be following you at all? What surprises me is why this has never struck me before. She at once came back to him. I suppose you're tired, Maskell. Let us sit down. Perhaps you have come a long way this morning. Oh, it's not tiredness, but a sudden gleam of sense. Do you know of any reason why I should be acting as your porter? He laughed again, but nevertheless sat down on the ground beside her. Tiedemann neither looked at him nor answered. Her head was half bent, so as to face the northern sky, where the alpine light was still glowing. Maskell followed her gaze, and also watched the glow for a moment or two in silence. Why don't you speak? He asked at last. What does that light suggest to you, Maskell? I'm not speaking of that light. Doesn't it suggest anything at all? Perhaps it doesn't. What does it matter? Not sacrifice. Maskell grew sullen again. Sacrifice of what? What do you mean? Hasn't it entered your head yet? Said Tiedemann, looking straight in front of her, and speaking in her delicate, hard manner, that this adventure of yours will scarcely come to an end until you have made some sort of sacrifice. He returned no answer, and she said nothing more. In a few minutes' time, Maskell got up of his own accord, and irreverently, and almost angrily, threw Crim Typhon's corpse over his shoulder again. How far do we have to go? He asked in a surly tone. An hour's walk. Lead on. Still, this isn't the sacrifice I mean, said Tiedemann quietly, as she went on in front. Almost immediately they reached more difficult ground. They had to pass from peak to peak, as from island to island. In some cases they were able to stride or jump across. but in others they had to make use of rude bridges of fallen timber. It appeared to be a frequented path. Underneath were the black, impenetrable abysses. On the surface were the glaring sunshine, the gay, painted rocks, the chaotic tangle of strange plants. There were countless reptiles and insects. The latter were thicker built than those of Earth, consequently still more disgusting, and some of them were of enormous size. One monstrous insect, as large as a horse, stood right in the center of their path without budging. It was armor-plated, had jaws like scimitars, and underneath its body was a forest of legs. Tidamine gave one malignant look at it and sent it crashing into the gulf. "What have I to offer except my life?" Maskell suddenly broke out. "And what good is that? It won't bring that poor girl back into the world. Sacrifice is not for utility. It's a penalty which we pay. I know that. The point is whether you can go on enjoying life after what has happened." She waited for Maskell to come even with her. "Perhaps you imagine I'm not man enough. You imagine that because I allowed poor Oceax to die for me." "She did die for you," said Tidamine in a quiet, emphatic voice. "That would be a second blunder of yours," returned Maskell just as firmly. "I was not in love with Oceax, and I'm not in love with life. Your life is not required." "Then I don't understand what you want, or what you are speaking about." "It's not for me to ask a sacrifice from you, Maskell. That would be compliance on your part, but not sacrifice. You must wait until you feel there's nothing else for you to do." "It's all very mysterious." The conversation was abruptly cut short by a prolonged and frightful crashing, roaring sound coming from a short distance ahead. It was accompanied by a violent oscillation of the ground on which they stood. They looked up, startled, just in time to witness the final disappearance of a huge mass of forest land, not 200 yards in front of them. Several acres of trees, plants, rocks, and soil, with all its teeming animal life, vanished before their eyes like a magic story. The new chasm was cut, as if by a knife. Beyond its farther edge, the alpine glow burned blue just over the horizon. "Now we shall have to make a detour," said Tidamine, halting. Maskell caught hold of her with his third hand. "Listen to me, while I try to describe what I'm feeling. When I saw that landslip, everything I have heard about the last destruction of the world came into my mind. It seemed to me as if I were actually witnessing it, and that the world were really falling to pieces. Then, where the land was, we now have this empty, awful gulf. That's to say, nothing. And it seems to me as if our life will come to the same condition. Where there was something, there will be nothing. But that terrible blue glare on the opposite side is exactly like the eye of fate. It accuses us and demands what we have made of our life, which is no more. At the same time, it is grand and joyful. The joy consists in this, that it is in our power to give freely what will later on be taken from us by force." Tidamine watched him attentively. "Then your feeling is that your life is worthless, and you make a present of it to the first one who asks?" "No, it goes beyond that. I feel that the only thing worth living for is to be so magnanimous that fate itself will be astonished at us. Understand me. It isn't cynicism or bitterness or despair, but heroism. It's hard to explain. Now you shall hear what sacrifice I offer you, Maskell. It's a heavy one, but that's what you seem to wish." "That is so. In my present mood, it can't be too heavy." "Then, if you are in earnest, resign your body to me. Now that Crim-Typhon's dead, I'm tired of being a woman. I fail to comprehend. Listen then. I wish to start a new existence in your body. I wish to be a male. I see it isn't worthwhile being a woman. I mean to dedicate my own body to Crim-Typhon. I shall tie his body and mine together and give them a common funeral in the burning lake. That's the sacrifice I offer you. As I said, it's a hard one, so you do ask me to die. Though how you can make use of my body is difficult to understand. No, I don't ask you to die. You will go on living. How is it possible without a body? Tiedemann gazed at him earnestly. There are many such beings, even in your world. There you call them spirits, apparitions, phantoms. They are in reality living wills, deprived of material bodies, always longing to act and enjoy, but quite unable to do so. Are you noble-minded enough to accept such a state, do you think? If it's possible, I accept it, replied Maskell quietly, not in spite of its heaviness, but because of it. But how is it possible? Undoubtedly, there are very many things possible in our world of which you have no conception. Now let us wait till we get home. I don't hold you to your word, for unless it's a free sacrifice, I will have nothing to do with it. I am not a man who speaks lightly. If you can perform this miracle, you have my consent, once for all. Then we'll leave it like that for the present, said Tiedemann sadly. They proceeded on their way. Owing to the subsidence, Tiedemann seemed rather doubtful at first as to the right road, but by making a long divergence, they eventually got around to the other side of the newly formed chasm. A little later on, in a narrow copse, crowning a miniature insulated peak, they fell in with a man. He was resting himself against a tree and looked tired, overheated, and despondent. He was young. His beardless expression bore an expression of unusual sincerity, and in other respects, he seemed a hardy, hard-working youth, of an intellectual type. His hair was thick, short, and flaxen. He possessed neither a sword nor a third arm, so presumably he was not a native of Ifdawn. His forehead, however, was disfigured by what looked like a haphazard assortment of eyes, 8 in number, of different sizes and shapes. They went in pairs, and whenever 2 were in use, it was indicated by a peculiar shining. The rest remained dull until their turn came. In addition to the upper eyes, he had the 2 lower ones, but they were vacant and lifeless. This extraordinary battery of eyes, alternatively alive and dead, gave the young man an appearance of almost alarming mental activity. He was wearing nothing but a sort of skin kilt. Maskell seemed somehow to recognize the face, though he had certainly never set eyes on it before. Tiedemann suggested to him to set down the corpse, and both sat down to rest in the shade. "Question him, Maskell," she said, rather carelessly. Jerking her head toward the stranger, Maskell sighed and asked aloud, from his seat on the ground, "What's your name, and where do you come from?" The man studied him for a few moments, first with one pair of eyes, then with another, then with a third. He next turned his attention to Tiedemann, who occupied him a still longer time. He replied at last, in a dry, manly, nervous voice, "I am Digrung. I have arrived here from Matterplay." His color kept changing, and Maskell suddenly realized of whom he reminded him. It was of Joywind. "Perhaps you're going to Poolingdred Digrung?" he inquired, interested. "As a matter of fact, I am, if I can find my way out of this accursed country. Possibly you are acquainted with Joywind there. She's my sister. I'm on my way to see her now. Why, do you know her? I met her yesterday." "What is your name, then?" "Maskell. I shall tell her I met you. This will be our first meeting for 4 years. Is she well and happy?" "Both, as far as I could judge." "You know Panawe?" "Her husband?" "Yes. But where do you come from? I've seen nothing like you before." "From another world." "Where is Matterplay?" "It's the first country one comes to beyond the sinking sea." "What is it like there? How do you amuse yourselves?" The same old murders and sudden deaths. Are you ill? Asked Digrung. Who is this woman? Why are you following at her heels like a slave? She looks insane to me. What's that corpse? Why are you dragging it around the country with you? Tiedemann smiled. I've already heard it said about matter play, that if one sows an answer there, a rich crop of questions immediately springs up. But why do you make this unprovoked attack on me, Digrung? I don't attack you, woman, but I know you. I see into you, and I see insanity. That wouldn't matter, but I don't like to see a man of intelligence like Maskell caught in your filthy meshes. I suppose even you clever matter play people sometimes misjudge character. However, I don't mind. Your opinion's nothing to me, Digrung. You'd better answer his questions, Maskell. Not for his own sake, but your feminine friend is sure to be curious about your having been seen in carrying a dead man. Maskell's underlip shot out. Tell your sister nothing, Digrung. Don't mention my name at all. I don't want her to know about this meeting of ours. Why not? I don't wish it. Isn't that enough? Digrung looked impassive. Thoughts and words, he said, which don't correspond with the real events of the world, are considered most shameful in matter play. I'm not asking you to lie, only to keep silent. To hide the truth is a special branch of lying. I can't accede to your wish. I must tell Yoywind everything, as far as I know it. Maskell got up, and Tiedemann followed his example. She touched Digrung on the arm and gave him a strange look. The dead man is my husband, and Maskell murdered him. Now you'll understand why he wishes you to hold your tongue. I guess there was some foul play, said Digrung. It doesn't matter. I can't falsify facts. Joywind must know. You refuse to consider her feelings? Said Maskell, turning pale. Feelings which flourish on illusions and sicken and die on realities aren't worth considering. But Joywinds are not of that kind. If you decline to do what I ask, at least return home without seeing her. Your sister will get very little pleasure out of the meeting when she hears your news. What are these strange relations between you? Demanded Digrung, eyeing him with suddenly aroused suspicion. Maskell stared back in a sort of bewilderment. Good God, you don't doubt your own sister, that pure angel. Tiedemann caught hold of him delicately. I don't know Joywind, but whoever she is and whatever she's like, I know this. She's more fortunate in her friend than in her brother. Now if you really value her happiness, Maskell, you will have to take some firm step or other. I mean to. Digrung, I shall stop your journey. If you intend a second murder, no doubt you are big enough. Maskell turned around to Tiedemann and laughed. I seem to be leaving a wake of corpses behind me on this journey. Why a corpse? There's no need to kill him. Thanks for that, said Digrung dryly. All the same, some crime is about to burst. I feel it. What must I do then? Asked Maskell. It is not my business, and to tell the truth, I am not very interested. If I were in your place, Maskell, I would not hesitate long. Don't you understand how to absorb these creatures who set their feeble, obstinate wills against yours? That is a worse crime, said Maskell. Who knows? He will live, but he will tell no tales. Digrung laughed, but changed color. I was right then. The monster has sprung into the light of day. Maskell laid a hand on his shoulder. You have the choice, and we are not joking. Do as I ask. You have fallen low, Maskell, but you are walking in a dream, and I can't talk to you. As for you, woman, sin must be like a pleasant bath to you. There are strange ties between Maskell and myself, but you are a passerby, a foreigner. I care nothing for you. Nevertheless, I shall not be frightened out of my plans, which are legitimate and right. Do as you please, said Tiedemann. If you come to grief, your thoughts will hardly have corresponded with the real events of the world, which is what you boast about. It is no affair of mine. I shall go on and not back, exclaimed Digrung with angry emphasis. Tiedemann threw a swift, evil smile at Maskell. Bear witness that I have tried to persuade this young man. Now you must come to a quick decision in your own mind as to which is of the greatest importance. Digrung's happiness or Joywin's. Digrung won't allow you to preserve them both. It won't take me long to decide. Digrung, I gave you a last chance to change your mind. As long as it's in my power, I shall go on and warn my sister against her criminal friends. Maskell again clutched at him, but this time with violence. Instructed in his action by some new and horrible instinct, he pressed the young man tightly to his body with all 3 arms. A feeling of wild, sweet delight immediately passed through him. Then for the first time he comprehended the triumphant joys of absorbing. It satisfied the hunger of the will, exactly as food satisfies the hunger of the body. Digrung proved feeble. He made little opposition. His personality passed slowly and evenly into Maskell's. The latter became strong and gorged. The victim gradually became paler and limper, until Maskell held a corpse in his arms. He dropped the body and stood trembling. He had committed his second crime. He felt no immediate difference in his soul, but Tiedemann shed a sad smile on him, like winter sunshine. He half expected her to speak, but she said nothing. Instead, she made a sign to him to pick up Crim-Typhon's corpse. As he obeyed, he wondered why Digrung's dead face did not wear the frightful Crystal Man mask. Why hasn't he altered? He muttered to himself. Tiedemann heard him. She kicked Digrung lightly with her little foot. He isn't dead, that's why. The expression you mean is waiting for your death. Then is that my real character? She laughed softly. You came here to carve a strange world, and now it appears you are carved yourself. Oh, there's no doubt about it, Maskell. You needn't stand there gaping. You belong to shaping, like the rest of us. You are not a king or a god. Since when have I belonged to him? What does that matter? Perhaps since you first breathed the air of torments, or perhaps since 5 minutes ago. Without waiting for his response, she set off through the copse and strode on to the next island. Maskell followed, physically distressed and looking very grave. The journey continued for half an hour longer, without incident. The character of the scenery slowly changed. The mountaintops became loftier and more widely separated from one another. The gaps were filled with rolling white clouds, which bathed the shores of the peaks like a mysterious sea. To pass from island to island was hard work. The intervening spaces were so wide. Tiedemann, however, knew the way. The intense light, the violet blue sky, the patches of vivid landscape emerging from the white vapor ocean made a profound impression on Maskell's mind. The glow of Alpine was hidden by the huge mass of Discorn, which loomed up straight in front of them. The green snow on the top of the gigantic pyramid had by now completely melted away. The black, gold, sand and crimson of its mighty cliffs stood out with terrific brilliance. They were directly beneath the bulk of the mountain, which was not a mile away. It did not appear dangerous to climb, but he was unaware on which side of it their destination lay. It was split from top to bottom by numerous straight fissures. A few pale green waterfalls descended here and there, like narrow, motionless threads. The face of the mountain was rugged and bare. It was strewn with detached boulders, and great, jagged rocks projected everywhere like iron teeth. Tiedemann pointed to a small black hole near the base, which might be a cave. That is where I live. You live here alone? Yes, it's an odd choice for a woman. and you are not unbeautiful either. A woman's life is over at 25, she replied, sighing, and I am far older than that. 10 years ago it would have been I who lived yonder, and not Oceax. Then all this wouldn't have happened. A quarter of an hour later, they stood within the mouth of the cave. It was 10 feet high, and its interior was impenetrably black. Put down the body in the entrance out of the sun, directed Tydomin. He did so. She cast a keenly scrutinizing glance at him. Does your resolution still hold, Maskell? Why shouldn't it hold? My brains are not feathers. Follow me then. They both stepped into the cave. At that very moment, a sickening crash, like heavy thunder just over their heads, set Maskell's weakened heart thumping violently. An avalanche of boulders, stones, and dust swept past the cave entrance from above. If their going in had been delayed by a single minute, they would have been killed. Tydomin did not even look up. She took his hand in hers and started walking with him into the darkness. The temperature became as cold as ice. At the first bend, the light from the outer world disappeared, leaving them in absolute blackness. Maskell kept stumbling over the uneven ground, but she kept tight hold of him and hurried him along. The tunnel seemed of interminable length. Presently, however, the atmosphere changed, or such was his impression. He was somehow led to imagine that they had come to a larger chamber. Here Tydomin stopped, and then forced him down with quiet pressure. His groping hand encountered stone, and by feeling it all over, he discovered that it was a sort of stone slab, or couch, raised a foot or 18 inches from the ground. She told him to lie down. Has the time come? Asked Maskell. Yes. He lay there waiting in the darkness, ignorant of what was going to happen. He felt her hand clasping his. Without perceiving any gradation, he lost all consciousness of his body. He was no longer able to feel his limbs or internal organs. His mind remained active and alert. Nothing particular appeared to be taking place. Then the chamber began to grow light, like very early morning. He could see nothing, but the retina of his eyes was afit. He fancied that he heard music, but while he was listening for it, it stopped. The light grew stronger, the air grew warmer. He heard the confused sound of distant voices. Suddenly, Tydomin gave his hand a powerful squeeze. He heard someone scream faintly, and then the light leaped up, and he saw everything clearly. He was lying on a wooden couch in a strangely decorated room, lighted by electricity. His hand was being squeezed, not by Tydomin, but by a man dressed in the garments of civilization, with whose face he was certainly familiar, but under what circumstances he could not recall. Other people stood in the background. They too were vaguely known to him. He sat up and began to smile, without any especial reason, and then stood upright. Everybody seemed to be watching him with anxiety and emotion. He wondered why. Yet he felt that they were all acquaintances. Two in particular he knew. The man at the farther end of the room, who paced restlessly backward and forward, his face transfigured by stern, holy grandeur, and that other big, bearded man, who was himself. Yes, he was looking at his own double, but it was just as if a crime-riddled man of middle age were suddenly confronted with his own photograph as an earnest, idealistic youth. His other self spoke to him. He heard the sounds, but did not comprehend the sense. Then the door was abruptly flung open, and a short, brutish-looking individual leaped in. He began to behave in an extraordinary manner to everyone around him, and after that came straight up to him, Maskell. He spoke some words, but they were incomprehensible. A terrible expression came over the newcomer's face, and he grasped his neck with a pair of hairy hands. Maskul felt his bones bending and breaking. Excruciating pains passed through all the nerves of his body, and he experienced a sense of impending death. He cried out and sank helplessly on the floor, in a heap. The chamber and the company vanished. The light went out. Once more he found himself in the blackness of the cave. He was this time lying on the ground, but Tiedemann was still with him, holding his hand. He was in horrible bodily agony, but this was only a setting for the despairing anguish that filled his mind. Tiedemann addressed him in tones of gentle reproach. "Why are you back so soon? I've not had time yet. You must return." He caught hold of her and pulled himself up to his feet. She gave a low scream, as though in pain. "What does this mean? What are you doing, Maskul?" "Crag," began Maskul, but the effort to produce his words choked him, so that he was obliged to stop. "Crag? What of Crag? Tell me quickly what has happened. Free my arm." He gripped her arm tighter. "Yes, I've seen Crag. I'm awake. Oh, you are awake, awake, and you must die," said Maskul in an awful voice. "But why? What has happened? You must die, and I must kill you, because I am awake and for no other reason. You blood-stained dancing mistress." Tiedemann breathed hard for a little time. Then she seemed suddenly to regain her self-possession. "You won't offer me violence, surely, in this black cave. No, the sun shall look on, for it is not a murder. But rest assured that you must die. You must expiate your fearful crimes. You have already said so, and I see you have the power. You have escaped me. It is very curious. Well then, Maskul, let us come outside. I am not afraid, but kill me courteously, for I have also been courteous to you. I make no other supplication." Chapter 11. On Discorn. By the time that they regained the mouth of the cavern, Bloodsomber was at its height. In front of them the scenery sloped downward, a long succession of mountain islands in a sea of clouds. Behind them the bright, stupendous crags of Discorn loomed up for 1,000 feet or more. Maskul's eyes were red, and his face looked stupid. He was still holding the woman by the arm. She made no attempt to speak or to get away. She seemed perfectly gentle and composed. After gazing at the country for a long time in silence, he turned toward her. "Whereabouts is the fiery lake you spoke of?" "It lies on the other side of the mountain." "But why do you ask? It is just as well if we have some way to walk. I shall grow calmer, and that's what I want. I wish you to understand that what is going to happen is not a murder, but an execution. It will taste the same," said Tiedemann. "When I have gone out of this country, I don't wish to feel that I have left a demon behind me, wandering at large. That would not be fair to others, so we will go to the lake, which promises an easy death for you." She shrugged her shoulders. "We must wait till Bloodsomber is over. Is this a time for luxurious feelings? However hot it is now, we will both be cool by evening. We must start at once. Without doubt, you are the master, Maskul. May I not carry Crim-Typhon?" Maskul looked at her strangely. "I grudge no man his funeral." She painfully hoisted the body on her narrow shoulders, and they stepped out into the sunlight. The heat struck them like a blow on the head. Maskul moved aside to allow her to precede him, but no compassion entered his heart. He brooded over the wrongs the woman had done him. The way went along the south side of the Great Pyramid, near its base. It was a rough road, clogged with boulders and crossed by cracks and water gullies. They could see the water, but could not get at it. There was no shade. Blisters formed on their skin, while all the water in their blood seemed to dry up. Maskul forgot his own tortures in his devil's delight at Tiedemann's. "Sing me a song," he called out presently. "A characteristic one." She turned her head and gave him a long, peculiar look. Then, without any sort of expostulation, started singing. Her voice was low and weird. The song was so extraordinary that he had to rub his eyes to ascertain whether he was awake or dream 258 is sitting. The slow surprises of the grotesque melody began to agitate him in a horrible fashion. The words were pure nonsense, or else their significance was too deep for him. "Where, in the name of all unholy things, did you acquire that stuff, woman?" Tiedemann shed a sickly smile, while the corpse swayed about with ghastly jerks over her left shoulder. She held it in position with her 2 left arms. "It's a pity we could not have met as friends, Maskell. I could have shown you a side of torments which now perhaps you will never see. The wild, mad side. But now it's too late and it doesn't matter." They turned the angle of the mountain and started to traverse the western base. "Which is the quickest way out of this miserable land?" asked Maskell. "It is easiest to go to Sant. Will we see it from anywhere?" "Yes, though it is a long way off." "Have you been there?" "I am a woman, and interdicted." "True, I have heard something of the sort." "But don't ask me any more questions," said Tiedemann, who was becoming faint. Maskell stopped at a little spring. He himself drank, and then made a cup of his hand for the woman, so that she might not have to lay down her burden. The Knoll water acted like magic. It seemed to replenish all the cells of his body, as though they had been thirsty sponge pores, sucking up liquid. Tiedemann recovered her self-possession. About 3/4 of an hour later, they worked around the second corner and entered into full view of the north aspect of Discorn. 100 yards lower down the slope on which they were walking, the mountain ended abruptly in a chasm. The air above it was filled with a sort of green haze, which trembled violently, like the atmosphere immediately over a furnace. "The lake is underneath," said Tiedemann. Maskell looked curiously about him. Beyond the crater, the country sloped away in a continuous descent to the skyline. Behind them, a narrow path channeled its way up through the rocks toward the towering summit of the pyramid. Miles away, in the northeast quarter, a long flat-topped plateau raised its head far above all the surrounding country. It was Sant, and there and then he made up his mind that that should be his destination that day. Tiedemann, meanwhile, had walked straight to the gulf and set down Crim-Typhon's body on the edge. In a minute or two, Maskell joined her. Arrived at the brink, he immediately flung himself at full length on his chest to see what could be seen of the lake of fire. A gust of hot, asphyxiating air smote his face and set him coughing, but he did not get up until he had stared his fill at the huge sea of green molten lava, tossing and swirling at no great distance below, like a living will. A faint sound of drumming came up. He listened intently, and as he did so his heart quickened, and the black cares rolled away from his soul. All the world and its accidents seemed at that moment false and without meaning. He climbed abstractedly to his feet. Tiedemann was talking to her dead husband. She was peering into the hideous face of ivory and fondling his violet hair. When she perceived Maskell, she hastily kissed the withered lips and got up from her knees. Lifting the corpse with all 3 arms, she staggered with it to the extreme edge of the gulf and, after an instant's hesitation, allowed it to drop into the lava. It disappeared immediately without sound. A metallic splash came up. That was Crim-Typhon's funeral. "Now I am ready, Maskell." He did not answer, but stared past her. Another figure was standing, erect and mournful, not far behind her. It was Joywind. Her face was wan, and there was an accusing look in her eyes. Maskell knew that it was a phantasm, and that the real Joywind was miles away, at Pooling Dread. "Turn around, Tiedemann," he said oddly, "and tell me what you see behind you." "I don't see anything," she answered, looking around. "But I see Joywind." Just as he was speaking, the apparition vanished. "Now I present you with your life, Tiedemann. She wishes it." The woman fingered her chin thoughtfully. "I little expected I should ever be beholden for my life to one of my own sex. But so be it. What really happened to you in my cavern? I really saw Crag. Yes, some miracle must have taken place." She suddenly shivered. "Come, let us leave this horrible spot. I shall never come here again." "Yes," said Maskell. "It stinks of death and dying. But where are we to go? What are we to do? Take me to Sant. I must get away from this hellish land." Tiedemann remained standing, dull and hollow-eyed. Then she gave an abrupt, bitter little laugh. "We make our journey together in singular stages. Rather than be alone, I'll come with you. But you know that if I set foot in Sant, they will kill me. At least set me on the way. I wish to get there before night. Is it possible? If you are willing to take risks with nature, and why should you not take risks today? Your luck holds, but someday or other it won't hold. Your luck." "Let us start," said Maskell. "The luck I've had so far is nothing to brag about." Blood-Somber was over when they set off. It was early afternoon, but the heat seemed more stifling than ever. They made no more pretense at conversation. Both were buried in their own painful thoughts. The land fell away from Discorn in all other directions, but toward Sant, there was a gentle, persistent rise. Its dark, distant plateau continued to dominate the landscape, and after walking for an hour they seemed none the nearer to it. The air was stale and stagnant. By and by, an upright object, apparently the work of man, attracted Maskell's notice. It was a slender tree stem, with the bark still on, embedded in the stony ground. From the upper end, 3 branches sprang out, pointing aloft at a sharp angle. They were stripped to twigs and leaves, and getting closer, he saw that they had been artificially fastened on, at equal distances from each other. As he stared at the object, a strange, sudden flush of confident vanity and self-sufficiency seemed to pass through him, but it was so momentary that he could be sure of nothing. "What may that be, Tiedemann?" "It is Hathor's Trifork, and what is its purpose? It's a guide to Sant. But who or what is Hathor?" "Hathor was the founder of Sant, many thousands of years ago. He laid down the principles they all live by, and that Trifork is his symbol. When I was a little child, my father told me the legends, but I've forgotten most of them." Maskell regarded it attentively. "Does it affect you in any way?" "And why should it do that?" she said, dropping her lips scornfully. "I am only a woman, and these are masculine mysteries." "A sort of gladness came over me," said Maskell, "but perhaps I am mistaken." They passed on. The scenery gradually changed in character. The solid parts of the land grew more continuous. The fissures became narrower and more infrequent. There were now no more subsidences or upheavals. The peculiar nature of the Efton Marist appeared to be giving place to a different order of things. Later on, they encountered a flock of pale blue jellies floating in the air. They were miniature animals. Tiedemann caught one in her hand and began to eat it, just as one eats a luscious pear plucked from a tree. Maskell, who had fasted since early morning, was not slow in following her example. A sort of electric vigor at once entered his limbs and body. His muscles regained their elasticity. His heart began to beat with hard, slow, strong throbs. "Food and body seem to agree well in this world," he remarked, smiling. She glanced toward him. "Perhaps the explanation is not in the food, but in your body. I brought my body with me. You brought your soul with you. But that's altering fast, too." In a copse, they came across a short, wide tree, without leaves, but possessing a multitude of thin, flexible branches, like the tentacles of a cuttlefish. Some of these branches were moving rapidly. A furry animal, somewhat resembling a wild cat, leapt about among them in the most extraordinary way. But the next minute, Maskell was shocked to realize that the beast was not leaping at all, but was being thrown from branch to branch by the volition of the tree, exactly as an imprisoned mouse is thrown by a cat from paw to paw. He watched the spectacle a while, with morbid interest. "That's a gruesome reversal of roles, Taidomin. One can see you're disgusted," she replied, stifling a yawn. "But that is because you are a slave to words. If you called that plant an animal, you would find its occupation perfectly natural and pleasing. And why should you not call it an animal? I am quite aware that, as long as I remain in the Ifdon Marist, I shall go on listening to this sort of language." They trudged along for an hour or more without talking. The day became overcast. A thin mist began to shroud the landscape, and the sun changed into an immense ruddy disk which could be stared at without flinching. A chill, damp wind blew against them. Presently it grew still darker. The sun disappeared, and, glancing first at his companion, and then at him, Stenine self, Maskell noticed that their skin and clothing were coated by a kind of green hoarfrost. The land was now completely solid. About half a mile, in front of them, against a background of dark fog, a moving forest of tall waterspouts gyrated slowly and gracefully hither and thither. They were green and self-luminous, and looked terrifying. Taidomin explained that they were not waterspouts at all, but mobile columns of lightning. "Then they are dangerous." "So we think," she answered, watching them closely. "Someone is wandering there who appears to have a different opinion." Among the spouts, and entirely encompassed by them, a man was walking with a slow, calm, composed gait, his back turned toward Maskell and Taidomin. There was something unusual in his appearance. His form looked extraordinarily distinct, solid, and real. "If there is danger, he ought to be warned," said Maskell. "He who is always anxious to teach will learn nothing," returned the woman coolly. She restrained Maskell by a pressure of the arm and continued to watch. The base of one of the columns touched the man. He remained unharmed, but turned sharply around, as if for the first time made aware of the proximity of these deadly waltzers. Then he raised himself to his full height and stretched both arms aloft above his head like a diver. He seemed to be addressing the columns. While they looked on, the electric spouts discharged themselves with a series of loud explosions. The stranger stood alone, uninjured. He dropped his arms. The next moment he caught sight of the two and stood still, waiting for them to come up. The pictorial clarity of his person grew more and more noticeable as they approached. His body seemed to be composed of some substance heavier and denser than solid matter. Taidomin looked perplexed. He must be a Santman. I have seen no one quite like him before. This is a day of days for me. He must be an individual of great importance, murmured Maskell. They now came up to him. He was tall, strong, and bearded, and was clothed in a shirt and breeches of skin. Since turning his back to the wind, the green deposit on his face and limbs had changed to streaming moisture, through which his natural color was visible. It was that of pale iron. There was no third arm. His face was harsh and frowning, and a projecting chin pushed the beard forward. On his forehead there were two flat membranes, like rudimentary eyes, but no sorb. These membranes were expressionless, but in some strange way seemed to add vigor to the stem eyes underneath. When his glance rested on Maskell, the latter felt as though his brain were being thoroughly traveled through. The man was middle-aged. His physical distinctness transcended nature. By contrast with him, every object in the neighborhood looked vague and blurred. Tiedeman's person suddenly appeared faint, sketch-like, without significance, and Maskell realized that it was no better with himself. A queer, quickening fire began running through his veins. He turned to the woman. "If this man is going to Sant, I shall bear him company. We can now part. No doubt you will think it high time. Let Tiedemann come too." The words were delivered in a rough, foreign tongue, but were as intelligible to Maskell as if spoken in English. "You who know my name also know my sex," said Tiedemann quietly. "It is death for me to enter Sant. That is the old law. I am the bearer of the new law. Is it so? And will it be accepted? The old skin is cracking. The new skin has been silently forming underneath. The moment of sloughing has arrived." The storm gathered. The green snow drove against them as they stood talking, and it grew intensely cold. None noticed it. "What is your name?" asked Maskell, with a beating heart. "My name, Maskell, is Spadeville. You, a voyager across the dark ocean of space, shall be my first witness and follower. You, Tiedemann, a daughter of the despised sex, shall be my second. The new law. But what is it? Until I seize, of what use it is for ear to hear. Come, both of you, to me." Tiedemann went to him unhesitatingly. Spadeville pressed his hand on her sorb and kept it there for a few minutes, while he closed his own eyes. When he removed it, Maskell observed that the sorb was transformed into twin membranes, like Spadeville's own. Tiedemann looked dazed. She glanced quietly about for a little while, apparently testing her new faculty. Then the tears started to her eyes, and snatching up Spadeville's hand, she bent over and kissed it hurriedly many times. "My past has been bad," she said. "Numbers have received harm from me, and none good. I have killed and worse, but now I can throw all that away and laugh. Nothing can now injure me. Oh, Maskell, you and I have been fools together." "Don't you repent your crimes?" asked Maskell. "Leave the past alone," said Spadeville. "It cannot be reshaped. The future alone is ours. It starts fresh and clean from this very minute. Why do you hesitate, Maskell? Are you afraid? What is the name of those organs? And what is their function? They are probes, and they are the gates opening into a new world." Maskell lingered no longer, but permitted Spadeville to cover his sorb, while the iron hand was still pressing his forehead. The new law quietly flowed into his consciousness, like a smooth-running stream of clean water, which had hitherto been dammed by his obstructive will. The law was duty. Chapter 12. Spadeville. Maskell found that his new organs had no independent function of their own, but only intensified and altered his other senses. When he used his eyes, ears, or nostrils, the same objects presented themselves to him, but his judgment concerning them was different. Previously, all external things had existed for him. Now, he existed for them. According to whether they served his purpose or were in harmony with his nature, or otherwise, they had been pleasant or painful. Now these words, pleasure and pain, simply had no meaning. The other two watched him while he was making himself acquainted with his new mental outlook. He smiled at them. "You were quite right, Taidomin," he said in a bold, cheerful voice. "We have been fools, so near the light all the time, and we never guessed it, always buried in the past or future, systematically ignoring the present, and now it turns out that apart from the present, we have no life at all. Thanks, Spadeville, for it," she answered, more loudly than usual. Maskell looked at the man's dark, concrete form. "Spadeville, now I mean to follow you to the end. I can do nothing less." The severe face showed no sign of gratification. Not a muscle relaxed. "Watch that you don't lose your gift," he said gruffly. Taidomin spoke. "You promised that I should enter Sant with you. Attach yourself to the truth, not to me, for I may die before you, but the truth will accompany you to your death. However, now let us journey together, all three of us." The words had not left his mouth before he put his face against the fine, driving snow and pressed onward toward his destination. He walked with a long stride. Taidomin was obliged to half-run in order to keep up with him. The three traveled abreast, Spadeville in the middle. The fog was so dense that it was impossible to see 100 yards ahead. The ground was covered by the green snow. The wind blew in gusts from the Sant Highlands and was piercingly cold. "Spadeville, are you a man or more than a man?" asked Maskell. "He that is not more than a man is nothing. Where have you now come from?" "From brooding, Maskell. Out of no other mother can truth be born. I have brooded and rejected, and I have brooded again. Now, after many months' absence from Sant, the truth at last shines forth for me in its simple splendor, like an upturned diamond." "I see its shining," said Maskell. "But how much does it owe to ancient Hathor? Knowledge has its seasons. The blossom was to Hathor, the fruit is to me. Hathor also was a brooder, but now his followers do not brood. In Sant all is icy selfishness, a living death. They hate pleasure, and this hatred is the greatest pleasure to them. But in what way have they fallen off from Hathor's doctrines? For him, in his sullen purity of nature, all the world was a snare, a limed twig, knowing that pleasure was everywhere, a fierce, mocking enemy, crouching and waiting at every corner of the road of life, in order to kill with its sweet sting the naked grandeur of the soul. He shielded himself behind pain. This also his followers do, but they do not do it for the sake of the soul, but for the sake of vanity and pride. What is the Trifork? The stem, Maskell, is hatred of pleasure. The first fork is disentanglement from the sweetness of the world. The second fork is power over those who still writhe in the nets of illusion. The third fork is the healthy glow of one who steps into ice-cold water. From what land did Hathor come? It is not said. He lived in Ifton for a while. There are many legends told of him while there. We have a long way to go, said Taidomin. Relate some of these legends, Spadeville. The snow had ceased. The day brightened. Branch Spell reappeared like a phantom sun, but bitter blasts of wind still swept over the plain. In those days, said Spadeville, there existed in Ifton a mountain island separated by wide spaces from the land around it. A handsome girl who knew sorcery caused a bridge to be constructed across which men and women might pass to it. Having by a false tale drawn Hathor onto this rock, she pushed at the bridge with her foot until it tumbled into the depths below. You and I, Hathor, are now together, and there is no means of separating. I wish to see how long the famous Frostman can withstand the breath, smiles, and perfume